$50,000 at BC. The night fire saved the tribe. You are about to travel back 50,000 years in time, not to an invented story, not to a work of fiction, but to a real night, lived by real people, the first humans who walked this planet, our direct ancestors, who faced one of the most critical moments in all of human existence. A night when 30 people were minutes away from freezing to death. Wolves were already approaching through the darkness. The fire was almost dead, and the fate of all humanity depended on a single young man, 2 stones, and a spark. If you want to discover stories like this every week, stories no one ever told you in school, about the first humans who survived the impossible so that you could be here today, subscribe now to the World of Early Humans channel, hit the bell, and join us on this journey through time. And now turn off the lights, because 50,000 years ago the world showed no mercy, and this story is only just beginning. 50,000 years ago, the world was a place no human alive today would be able to recognize. Not because the Earth was different in its shape. The continents were already more or less where they are today. The oceans already filled their basins. The mountains already rose in the places where they still rise. What was different was everything else: the climate, the life, the scale of danger, and the absolute fragility of a young species that had not yet decided whether it would survive or disappear, like so many others before it. The planet was in the middle of an ice age, not the last, but one of the most intense. Enormous glaciers covered vast stretches of what we now call Northern Europe, Central Asia, and North America. Sea levels were significantly lower than today because immense quantities of water were trapped in the form of ice over the continents. This meant that land bridges existed between places that today are separated by oceans, connections that allowed animals and the first humans to move along routes that are now completely submerged. The world was, in physical terms, literally larger and colder, much colder than anyone living in a city today can imagine. On the open plains of Central Europe, where this story takes place, temperatures during winter could drop to 40 degrees below zero. Not as an exception, as a rule. The wind from the north carried ice particles that cut exposed skin within seconds. Snow accumulated in compact layers that could last months without melting. Rivers froze from bank to bank, so solid that heavy animals crossed them without difficulty. The trees that managed to survive in this environment were hardy and sparse. There were no dense temperate forests like the ones we know today, but rather a landscape scientists call the mammoth steppe, open, swept by wind, dominated by cold-resistant grasses and low shrubs that barely reached an adult's waist. It was in this environment that the Ice Age animals thrived, and when we say thrived, we are not being ironic, because those animals were extraordinary. The woolly mammoth with its dense fur and curved tusks that could measure 4 meters in length, the woolly rhinoceros, an armored and furry version of the animal we know today, weighing more than 3 tons, the megaloceros, a giant deer whose antlers could have a span of 4 meters from tip to tip, the steppe bison, larger and heavier than the modern American bison, the wild horse, robust and cold-adapted, the reindeer, which migrated in immense herds across the frozen plains, following seasonal cycles with a precision that challenged any human observation, and the predators that made this world a place where one mistake could be your last. The giant wolf hunted in large and coordinated packs, using encirclement and exhaustion tactics that rivaled in sophistication those of the first humans themselves. The cave hyena was larger and more aggressive than the modern hyena, capable of crushing mammoth bones with its bite and chasing prey for kilometers without stopping. The cave lion was 10 to 20% larger than the modern African lion, without a mane, cold-adapted, and so skilled at ambushes that it left very few traces of its hunts. The cave bear could weigh more than 600 kilograms and was omnivorous, which meant it competed with the first humans not only as a potential predator, but as a direct competitor for the same food resources. In a world like this, being human was not an obvious advantage, not physically at least. The first humans of the Upper Paleolithic were strong by modern standards. Lives of constant physical effort from childhood created dense and muscular bodies, but they were too slow to escape a lion, too weak to face a bear in hand-to-hand combat, lacking claws, fangs, or protective fur. What they had was the brain, and what the brain had produced over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution were tools, language, social cooperation, and fire. Fire was the great equalizer. It was the technology that placed those fragile first humans in a position to compete in a world that had been designed by natural selection to eliminate them. With fire, they could cook meat, which multiplied the caloric value of each meal. They could heat their shelter, which allowed them to survive nights that would otherwise be fatal. They could harden the tips of wooden spears in the heat of the flames, making their weapons more effective. And they could keep predators away, because virtually all wild animals have an instinctive fear of fire that is more powerful than hunger itself. For that small tribe of 30 people sheltering among the rocks of that frozen plain, fire was not just a tool. It was the condition of possibility for everything else. It was what made it possible to exist in that place, in that climate, in that world. And on that night, a night like so many others, except different from all the others, the fire was dying. The sun had disappeared behind the ice-covered mountains earlier than expected. This happened sometimes in deep winter. The light lasted only a few hours, and when it left completely without gradation, without the long and gentle twilight of summer days. The darkness arrived quickly and absolutely, punctuated only by the stars, so many stars that they formed a white haze above their heads, the Milky Way visible in its full extent because there was no artificial light anywhere in the entire world to compete with it. The tribe had arrived at that shelter 3 days earlier. It was a good place, a rock formation that created a protective angle against the north wind, with a stone wall tall enough to block the most violent gusts and an opening narrow enough to be defended by 2 or 3 armed men. The hard-packed earth floor kept the black marks of ancient fires left by other first humans, other tribes, other times, who had found the same refuge and left behind only those carbon marks as proof that they had existed. There was a woman in the group who was older than the others. Not the oldest in absolute years, but the one who carried the kind of knowledge that only comes from having paid close attention for a very long time. She had learned to read the sky the way modern navigators read instruments. She knew what that specific coloring on the horizon at dusk meant, a grayish purple with a low golden band that was not a normal sunset. It was a warning. She knew what that smell in the air meant, that combination of fresh snow and something older, colder coming from far away. She had called the others inside earlier than expected that afternoon, and the hunters who were still outside had seen her gesture and returned without question. That was the kind of authority that needed no title. The fire had been fed with more care than usual that afternoon. The larger branches were positioned at an angle to maximize the duration of combustion. Pieces of dry bone, which burn slowly and produce intense heat, were set aside for the middle of the night. There was a logic to that preparation that was simultaneously intuitive and sophisticated, the result of generations of observation passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, from elder to youth around other fires in other shelters on other winter nights that had survived precisely because someone had paid attention to the ones that came before. The tribe organized itself around the flames with that silent order that needed no commands. The children stayed in the center, closer to the heat, further from the dark edge where the world ended and danger began. Women with babies positioned themselves slightly further away, but still within the circle of light. The younger men stayed on the periphery, sitting with their spears within arm's reach, watching the darkness with the particular attention of those trained from childhood to distinguish normal sounds from sounds that should not be there. For a time, everything was fine. The fire crackled strongly, throwing shadows that danced on the rock walls as though they were living creatures. The smell of smoke and burning wood was familiar and comforting. The smell of safety. The smell these first humans had associated since birth with protection and belonging. Some of the adults chewed pieces of dried meat left over from the last hunt. A young woman hummed something softly to a crying baby. The sounds of the outside world, the wind, the occasional noises of the distant forest, the crack of some branch breaking under the weight of snow, seemed distant and harmless when there was fire between them and the darkness. Then the wind changed. It was not gradual. It was a sudden shift, as if the weather itself had made a decision. A gust entered from the wrong angle in the shelter, from the side the rock formation did not protect. and hit the flames directly. The fire did not go out, but it folded over itself in a way that the more experienced members of the tribe immediately recognized as a bad sign. The flames that had previously risen vertical and confident now bent horizontally, licked by the wind, consuming themselves faster than they could be fed. The older woman raised her eyes to the sky and stayed still for a moment. Then she said something brief to the man beside her, 2 or 3 syllables, perhaps a word, perhaps not, and he immediately stood up and went to get more fuel. But when he reached the pile of branches that had been set aside for the night, he found something no one had foreseen: moisture. The wind that had shifted had brought with it humid air from somewhere, and the cold had frozen that moisture onto the outer branches of the pile. Not all of them. The ones in the center were still dry. But the ones on top, the easiest to reach, were covered with a thin layer of ice that made them useless for now. He took what he could and returned to the fire. He threw in the branches that still served, but there were few. The flames accepted the new fuel with a brief crackle and then continued to diminish. The temperature inside the shelter dropped visibly. You could see it in the behavior of the children, who curled more deeply into the furs, and in the breath of the people, which began producing small white clouds of vapor even inside the supposedly protected space. The leader knelt before the fire. He was a man who had seen about 35 winters, which placed him among the oldest in the group, and by definition, among the most respected. His body carried the map of a life lived at the edge, a long scar on his left forearm from when a deer had unexpectedly turned during a hunt, 3 fingers of his right hand slightly crooked from an old, poorly healed fracture, a gentle bump on his nose that had been straight before a bad encounter with another group of first humans years earlier. But his eyes were intact and sharp, and what they saw now gripped the heart. The embers. Only embers. Red and pulsing like open wounds, but without flames. The wind came in irregular gusts, and each gust extinguished them a little more. They were like eyes trying to stay open but losing the battle. He blew hard, carefully, with that specific blowing technique that anyone who has ever tried to rekindle a fire knows, not directly at the center, but around it, feeding oxygen from the edges. An orange glow appeared, pulsed, and a new gust of wind killed it before it could transform into flame. In the distance, the first howl. It was still far away, perhaps a kilometer, perhaps 2. But in that silence of the frozen plain, sounds traveled in a way that has no equivalent in the acoustic environments of the modern world. That howl arrived clear and defined, and its meaning was understood by all who heard it the same way a siren is understood today. Danger. Approach. Assessment. The hunters rose without needing an order. They positioned themselves at the entrance of the shelter with their spears pointing outward, forming that instinctive barrier that was simultaneously strategic and symbolic. Strategic because it created a real physical obstacle. Symbolic because it sent a message to any predator that might be watching. This group is not unprotected. This group responds. But everyone knew that the most effective message of all was the fire, and the fire was dying. The young man had observed all of this in silence from the back of the shelter, not because he was timid or cowardly. He had shown enough courage in previous hunts that no one doubted that. But there was something in his nature that made him pause before acting, calculate before moving, observe the problem from every angle before deciding on an approach. It was a quality that sometimes made him seem hesitant in the eyes of the other first humans around him, but that in practice made him more effective than most in situations that demanded precision rather than brute force. He had been studying the problem ever since the wind changed. Not consciously, not with explicitly formulated words or plans. The human brain of 50,000 years ago worked differently from ours in many respects, but the capacity for implicit problem processing, that work the mind does below the level of verbal consciousness, was probably just as developed as ours, perhaps more so. While his eyes watched the embers dying, and his ears registered the distant howls, and his body felt the growing cold, some part of his brain was assembling and disassembling solutions at a speed his language would not have been able to keep up with. And then he knew what to do. He stood up slowly, not abruptly, which could have created unnecessary alarm, and walked to where the leader was still kneeling before the embers. The two looked at each other. It was a moment that, in a language with more words, would have been filled with requests, explanations, negotiations. But in that economy of language of the first humans, a look was enough. The young man said with his eyes, "I know what to do, let me try." And the leader said with his eyes, "I already tried and could not manage it, but yes, try." The young man went first to the pile of branches and examined what was left. The outer branches were frozen, useless for now. But when he pushed aside the top layers, he found in the center of the pile a reserve of fuel that was still dry, thin branches, almost like twigs, that had been protected by the weight and heat of the ones above. There were few. They would have to be enough. Then he searched the edges of the shelter for other materials. He found what he was looking for, dry moss that had been used as padding for sleeping, tucked between the folds of some furs, scraps of old leather, residue from when the animal hides had been worked, fibers from some plant that someone had carried for reasons no longer clear, but that now found their purpose. And, crucially, 2 stones he had noticed days earlier when the group had arrived at the shelter. Flint stones of exceptional quality with that particular texture, almost glassy, that indicated the ability to produce hot and abundant sparks. He arranged everything methodically, building around the nearly dead embers a small structure that any modern firefighter would recognize as technically correct. The finest and most flammable material at the base, near the embers, forming a chamber that allowed air to circulate, slightly thicker material above to sustain the flames when they appeared, and a barrier on the sides, using some larger branches positioned vertically to create minimal protection against the wind gusts that continued arriving at irregular intervals. Then he knelt, picked up the flint stones, one in each hand, and began to work. The first strike produced a dry sound and a spark that lasted less than 1/10 of a second before disappearing in the cold air. The second strike. Another sound, another spark. It disappeared. The third, the fourth, the fifth. His hands were already numb by the 10th strike. The cold had dulled the sensation in his fingers in a way that made it difficult to hold the stones with the firmness needed, and the heavy, cold stones were hard to handle with hands that did not respond completely. One of the stones slipped slightly on the 12th strike, and the impact missed the correct angle, producing only a click with no spark at all. One of the howls outside sounded closer, then another from a different angle. At least 2 animals, perhaps more, communicating in their language about what they were seeing, a shelter of first humans with diminishing light, a situation that was changing in real time towards something advantageous for them. One of the hunters at the shelter entrance briefly turned his head inside, assessing the situation. His eyes met the young man's, and in them was that specific mixture of urgency and trust. Urgency because the time was real and limited, trust because he had decided to believe in what he was seeing. Then he turned back to watch the darkness. The young man reorganized his position. He changed the angle of the stones. He adjusted the position of his fingers, finding a grip that would work even with numb hands. He breathed deeply, that cutting air that hurt the lungs, and began again. More slowly this time, more deliberate. Each strike positioned carefully, seeking not only the strongest spark, but the trajectory that would carry that spark exactly to the dry moss waiting below. Strike, spark, stronger this time, clearly visible even in the weak light of the dying embers. But it fell outside the target. Strike, spark. It fell on the earth beside the moss. Nothing. Strike, spark. This one was different. It fell directly on the dry moss, and for an instant, a fraction of a second that seemed much longer than it was, there was an orange point glowing in the moss. Everyone who was watching held their breath at the same time, as though the entire group were a single lung. The orange point went out. No one said anything. The young man did not raise his eyes. He repositioned the stones and continued. It was at that moment that the leader moved. Without saying anything, without announcing what he was doing, he knelt beside the young man and raised his large and calloused hands, hands that had carried dead animals for kilometers, that had knapped flint into tools, that had pulled children away from dangers they were not yet old enough to recognize, and formed a barrier against the wind. An imperfect, incomplete barrier, but a real one. The older woman, watching all of this from where she sat, made a brief sound that was a call, and 2 other women understood immediately. One of them took a large hide and stretched it horizontally above the stones and the moss, creating an improvised roof that blocked the wind coming from above. The other positioned herself on the opposite side from the leader, completing the shield. More people approached. A middle-aged man with a shoulder that had been dislocated on a hunt months before and that still limited him. He could not hold a spear with the necessary strength, but he could sit beside the fire and use his own body as a barrier. A girl of about 12, who had grown enough to understand what was happening, she knelt and stretched out her hands, imitating the leader's gesture, completing a gap in the shield. In absolute silence, without command, without discussion, the entire tribe had reorganized itself around the young man and the small pile of moss and dry branches that were everyone's only hope. A single organism, each part finding its place instinctively, driven by that collective understanding that is one of the most extraordinary and least celebrated aspects of human nature. Inside that circle of bodies, the wind diminished. The young man felt the difference immediately. The air around the stones and the moss became more still, warmer, only microscopically, but different enough to be perceived by hands that were trying to execute a precision task. He adjusted the angle of the stones one last time, found the right support point for each thumb and struck. The spark was large. It was the largest so far, a white and brilliant flicker that traveled a visible trajectory through the air and landed exactly in the center of the small pile of dry moss. For a moment, nothing. The kind of nothing that lasts only a second but seems like a lifetime. Then a thread of smoke, thin as a hair, almost invisible, rising in a spiral from the blackened moss. The young man lay down on the frozen ground and placed his face a few centimeters from the moss. He blew. Not hard, gently, steadily, with that specific rhythm he had watched the elders use, that delicate balance between giving enough oxygen to feed the nascent flame and not giving enough air to extinguish it. It was like breathing life into something that had not yet decided whether it wanted to exist. The smoke increased. The moss blackened over a larger area. A red color appeared in the center, not a flame yet, but that incandescence that precedes flame, that state of suspension between non-being and being. He kept blowing. The incandescence grew. It reached the leather scraps beside the moss. They caught, with a small, almost inaudible crackle with a thick and acrid smoke that was the specific smell of burning leather. And then, with that silent and definitive beauty that fire has when it decides to be born, a flame appeared, small, trembling, the size of a water drop, orange-blue at the base, yellow at the tips, real. The young man kept blowing, more slowly now, more carefully, with the attention of someone who knows this is the most dangerous moment, when the flame exists, but is still so fragile that any mistake can kill it. The flame grew. It reached the thin branches he had positioned above the moss. The first branch caught with a satisfying crackle, and suddenly there was not one flame but several, a constellation of small tongues of fire feeding each other, growing, warming the surrounding air, consuming the larger branches that awaited their turn. Within 30 seconds there was a fire, not the large and secure fire of before, but a real fire, flames rising vertically, producing visible heat in the surrounding air, illuminating the faces of those first humans with that amber light that was the color of survival. What happened next was silent and collective. The people who had formed the human shield slowly pulled back, making space. Those who were further away came closer. The children, who had stayed quiet with that instinctive silence of children, who understand that something important is happening, even without completely grasping what, began to move again, stretching toward the heat, like sunflowers toward light. Adults released breaths they did not know they had been holding. Someone made a sound, not a word, but something between relief and gratitude that was echoed by others around them. The leader placed more branches on the flames, with that careful methodology that was the mark of someone who had learned to respect fire, one at a time. Increasing sizes, calculated angles. The fire responded with lively and bright crackles, growing into something that would now be difficult to extinguish even if the wind tried. The howls outside paused, then they resumed, but different, more distant, moving away. The wolves had assessed the situation and reached their own conclusion. The risk was not worth the reward. The light was back, stronger than before, and the group of first humans that had seemed vulnerable minutes ago now seemed different. It seemed alive. The leader placed his hand on the young man's shoulder. It was a simple gesture. In a culture with more ceremonies, it would have been something more elaborate, a ritual, a declaration, a formal transfer of status. But in that economy of gestures of the first humans, it was everything. It was recognition. It was belonging. It was the group saying to one of its members, "You did something that mattered. You are part of this. You matter." The young man looked at the fire for a long moment. His hands were bleeding slightly. The skin of his fingers had cracked with the cold and the repeated impact of the stones. But he stretched them toward the heat without seeming to feel pain. Only warmth. Only the fire that had been born from his hands and now crackled strong and real before him. That night did not end with the fire being rekindled. The storm that had arrived from the wrong angle continued for hours. The wind, the snow, the cold that did not relent. The hunters maintained guard at the entrance of the shelter in shifts, taking turns so that no one was exposed to the cold for too long. The older woman stayed awake feeding the fire, adding fuel at precise intervals that had been learned and refined over years of practice, not too much at once, which could smother the flames, not too little, which would let them diminish. At the coldest hours of the night, those hours before dawn when the temperature falls even further, when the body is most exhausted and the mind most vulnerable to despair, the wolves made one last approach. This time they came closer, probably attracted by the smell of dried meat, or simply by the pressure of hunger that makes calculating animals more willing to take risks. The hunters at the entrance saw the golden reflections of eyes in the darkness beyond the circle of light, that specific glint that was immediately recognizable and immediately terrifying. What followed was a demonstration of first human coordination that in that context was as sophisticated as any modern military operation. The hunters did not advance. Advancing would mean leaving the circle of light and entering the darkness where the wolves had the advantage. Instead, they made noise. They shouted, banged stones against each other, shook their spears in the air. Two of them picked up smaller branches that were catching fire at the edge of the campfire and raised them, improvised torches that projected the light further forward, pushing the darkness beyond the reach of the wolves. The golden eyes retreated. After a few minutes, they disappeared completely. The night continued, the fire continued, and the tribe continued with it. When the sun finally rose, slow, pale, without the strength of a summer dawn, but present, real, announcing that the night had ended, the world the tribe found outside was transformed. Snow had covered everything during the night, erasing the marks of the previous day, and replacing them with a uniform and silent white that stretched across the plain as far as the eye could see. The sparse trees were heavy with snow. The wind had dropped to a whisper. The sky was a pale and crystalline blue, that winter morning blue that seems to have no depth, as though painted on porcelain. And printed in that white snow, right around the entrance to the shelter, were tracks, large, deep, with that unmistakable shape of 4 toes and a central pad that belongs to wolves. The nearest tracks were less than 3 meters from the entrance, so close that some of the adults, when they saw them, stood still for a moment in silence, contemplating what that distance meant, how close that night had truly been to the limit. The children observed the tracks with that particular mixture of fascination and fear that any parent today would recognize immediately. One of them placed their own hand inside one of the tracks, the hand of a child of perhaps 6 years old, disappearing completely inside the print of a paw. That simple and silent gesture communicated more eloquently than words could have managed the true size of the danger of that night. To fully understand what happened on that night, 50,000 years ago, it is necessary to understand who those first humans were in terms that go beyond the immediate narrative. Because there is a persistent misconception about prehistoric humans that distorts our understanding of who we were, and therefore of who we are. The anatomically modern Homo sapiens has existed for at least 300,000 years. The first humans who lived 50,000 years ago in Europe were already biologically identical to us in absolutely every relevant aspect. Their brains were the same size, In fact, there is some evidence that Upper Paleolithic skulls were slightly larger than modern ones, though the significance of this is debated. Their synapses worked the same way. Their cognitive capabilities were the same. Memory, abstract reasoning, planning for the future, understanding of causality, theory of mind, the ability to model what another person is thinking and feeling. All of this was fully present. What differentiated those first humans from us was not intelligence. It was accumulated knowledge. We are born into a world where 50,000 years of accumulated discoveries are available to anyone who can read, in books, in universities, on the internet, in any elementary school. Those first humans were born into a world where the total available knowledge fit within a tribe, passed down orally from generation to generation, limited to what any individual could memorize and transmit. The difference between them and us is not genetic or cognitive. It is simply the size of the library each of us has access to. And given those conditions, what those first humans accomplished is extraordinary. They developed sophisticated hunting technologies. The spear thrower, which multiplies the range and force of a throw, was invented in this period. They developed leather tanning techniques still studied today by specialized craftspeople. They created art. The cave paintings at Lascaux in France and at Altamira in Spain, which are contemporary with this period, show a mastery of form, perspective, and visual narrative that has nothing to envy compared to much of what was produced centuries later. They developed oral communication systems complex enough to transmit not only practical information, but stories, myths, collective memory, the foundations of all culture. And they managed fire. Not simply keeping fires burning, but developing over generations a body of technical knowledge about how to ignite, sustain, control, and use fire in different conditions and for different purposes that was genuinely complex. Those first humans knew that certain woods burned more slowly and produced more heat. They knew that dry animal bones burned differently from wood, with a more intense and longer-lasting heat that made them useful for the longest nights. They knew how to position branches to maximize air circulation and how to protect embers from the wind without smothering the fire. They knew, above all, that keeping the fire alive was a collective responsibility that required constant attention and specific technical knowledge. This knowledge was part of the most precious capital a tribe possessed, more valuable than any individual tool or weapon, because it was the knowledge that allowed all the other tools and weapons to function. And it was transmitted in the only way available, person to person, generation to generation, around the very fire that was its subject. Modern scientific research has revealed something extraordinary about the role of fire in the evolution of the first humans that goes far beyond the obvious. The primatologist Richard Wrangham of Harvard University developed over decades a theory he calls the cooking hypothesis, the proposal that the control of fire and the practice of cooking food was the primary driver of the physical and cognitive changes that transformed the first hominids into Homo sapiens. The argument is elegant and powerful. Cooked foods are dramatically easier to digest than raw foods. Cooking breaks down cellular structures that resist digestion, denatures proteins, making them more accessible to digestive enzymes, and in some cases neutralizes natural toxins that would be present in raw food. The result is that a body can extract far more calories from an equivalent quantity of cooked food than from raw food. For a primate that spent a significant portion of its waking hours simply chewing and digesting, as the great apes still do today, this was a revolution. The extra calories released by cooking were invested, over generations of natural selection, in the most energetically expensive organ in the human body, the brain. The adult human brain, which represents only 2% of body mass, consumes approximately 20% of all the energy the body produces. Maintaining a brain of that size functioning is extremely costly in metabolic terms, and that cost only became viable when cooking multiplied the energy efficiency of the diet of the first humans. In other words, without fire, there would not have been enough calories to sustain the modern human brain. Without the modern human brain, there would have been no complex language, no art, no technology, or any of the things we define as civilization. Fire is not merely part of human history, It is, in a very concrete and biological sense, the reason human history exists. But fire did something more beyond calories and brain size. It did something with time, specifically with the night. For any animal that does not control fire, the night is basically lost time. Hours of maximum vulnerability to be passed in immobility, preferably in some hiding place, waiting for the sun to return. Fire transformed the night into something completely different for the first humans, into social time. Researchers who study groups of contemporary hunter-gatherers who still live in relatively traditional ways, such as the San of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, or the Agta of the Philippines, have discovered a consistent pattern. Conversations during the day are predominantly practical, about food, work, logistics. But at night, around the fire, the nature of conversations changes completely. At night, the first humans told stories, and not simple stories. Stories about the spiritual world, about the ancestors, about the rules of conduct of the group, about historical events that needed to be remembered, about lessons that needed to be passed on. The nighttime stories around the fire were, in those first human groups, the primary mechanism of cultural transmission, the way in which the knowledge and values of one generation passed to the next. They were books before books, documentaries before screens, records before writing. On that night, 50,000 years ago, after the fire returned and the wolves moved away and the children fell asleep, it is almost certain that someone told the story of what had just happened. A story about the fire that almost died, about the young man who saved it, about the wolves in the eyes of the darkness. That story was told that night, and the next night, and the one after that, modified each time, amplified, incorporating new details and losing others, gaining the symbolic weight that stories gain when passed from hand to hand over time, like stones polished by water. And here we arrive at something that is simultaneously simple and vertiginous. The story you have just heard is, in some real and not merely metaphorical sense, that very same story. Distorted by 50,000 years of retransmission, translated into languages that did not exist when it happened, adapted for technologies that would be completely incomprehensible to the first humans who lived it, but fundamentally the same story. The night the fire almost died, the person who saved it, the tribe that survived, humanity that continued. There are currently about 8 billion human beings in the world. Every one of them, every person alive today, in any part of the planet, of any origin and in any condition, is a direct descendant of groups of first humans who survived nights like that one. The mathematics of ancestry is relentless. If you go back far enough in time, every person alive today shares common ancestors with every other person alive today. We are literally one family, a very large, very dispersed family that separated long ago and took very different paths, but that traces back to the same lines of survival that passed through the filter of winters like that one, of predators like those, of nights when the fire almost died but did not die. This is not poetry, it is genetics. The geneticist Graham Coop of the University of California at Davis demonstrated mathematically that any person who lived more than a few thousand years ago and had descendants is an ancestor of virtually all of humanity alive today, or of no one. The lines of survival are convergent. They join together as we go back in time, until we reach small populations where everyone was related. The first humans of 50,000 years ago were very close to those founding populations. That tribe of 30 people who survived that specific night was not only surviving for itself, it was surviving for all of us. When we look back 50,000 years, we are not looking at strangers. We are looking at ourselves, at the version of ourselves that existed before all the layers of culture, technology and history that separated us from that frozen plain. The intelligence that young man used to rekindle the fire is the same you use to solve problems. The silent cooperation that tribe of first humans demonstrated in forming the human shield is the same that is at work in any team, any family, any community that functions well. The instinct to protect the children first, to place the most vulnerable in the center of the circle, that has not disappeared. It is in every maternity ward, in every school, in every system of social protection that any society has ever built. We are those people. They are us. The sun is rising over the snow-covered plain. The tribe is emerging from the shelter, one by one, stepping in the wolf tracks, with that instinctive caution that is simultaneously fear and courage. The hunters are already moving away in groups of 3, tracking fresh prints in the immaculate white. The older woman is crouching beside the fire, adding the last branches with those hands that know exactly what to do. The children are reaching out to touch the paw marks in the snow, measuring the size of the danger that has passed. And the young man is there, among them, part of all of this in a way that yesterday morning had not yet been completely decided. His wounded hands hold a spear. His eyes, which always observed more than they spoke, are on the horizon where the snow-covered mountains cut against the pale blue of the winter morning. Before him lie the next kilometers of a life that will be lived entirely outdoors, entirely in the present, entirely in service of immediate survival. He will not know that he existed in any record. He will have no name in any written history. He will leave no trace beyond the genes that will be passed forward, invisible and silent across 2,000 generations, until they reach the person who is reading these words now. But he lived. That night, he lived. And because he lived, and because the tribe lived, and because the fire lived, this story exists to be told. The next time you light a flame, a match, a candle, the kitchen stove, the fireplace on a cold day, pause for just a second. Not because you need to, not because it is an obligation, but because that small and everyday gesture is the same gesture a young man of 18 made on a frozen plain 50,000 years ago, with hands bleeding from the cold, while wolves howled in the darkness and an entire tribe of first humans waited in silence to find out whether they would still have a morning. He succeeded. You are here to prove it. If this video took you back through time and made you feel up close who the first humans were that made your existence possible, subscribe to the World of Early Humans channel, because every week we travel together back to these nights that changed the world. Share it with someone who needs to know this story, and we will see you on the next journey.